Greetings and welcome to today's panel on the SolarWinds hack, where we'll be assessing its current and future implications. I'm Audrey Kurth Cronin, Professor of International Security at the School of International Service at American University, and also the Director of the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. And the center is sponsoring this event. We're honored today to host 3 scholars and practitioners who are working at the cutting edge of cyber policy and intelligence. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Turning first to Dr. Ben Buchanan. He's a senior faculty fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, one of our sister centers right here in Washington, D.C. He also teaches at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Before joining Georgetown, Ben was a fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's the author of 2 books, The Cybersecurity Dilemma, which came out in 2017, and more recently, The Hacker and the State, Cyber Attacks and the New Normal of Geopolitics, which came out last year. And in the interest of show and tell, I pulled this one off my shelves. I have your other book, Ben, in my office at work. It's a pleasure to have you here. Secondly is Dr. Alexi Drew. She is a research associate at the Policy Institute for King's College London. She is also an associate fellow at Global Network on Extremism and Technology and an executive manager at the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative. Her work focuses upon emerging technologies, the international norms surrounding them, and their impact upon international relations and geopolitics. She received her PhD from Royal Holloway, University of London, and her thesis examined cyber capabilities and norm construction methods. Currently, she is working on a postdoctoral project examining the role of social media in conflict escalation, and has also researched and published on the role of emerging technologies in China's foreign policy. Welcome, Dr. Drew. And finally, my co-director and colleague, Professor Josh Rovner. Josh is an associate professor in the School of International Service at American University. He's the author of Fixing the Facts, National Security and the Politics of Intelligence, which came out in 2011. And he's co-editor of Chaos in the Liberal Order, The Trump Presidency and International Politics in the 21st Century. I have that book in the other office too, Josh. Dr. Rovner is the managing editor of H. Diplo's International Security Studies Forum, deputy editor of the Journal of Strategic Studies, and he writes a regular column for War on the Rocks. During the academic year 2018-2019, he served as scholar in residence at the National Security Agency and US Cyber Command. So we have a very strong panel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our experts. Let me say a word or 2 about how we'll proceed. Each of our scholars will give a quick 10 to 15-minute overview about the SolarWinds hack. We're going to go in alphabetical order as we've agreed in advance. So that will be Dr. Buchanan, Dr. Drew, and Dr. Rovner. Then I'll ask a question or 2, and then I'll open it for questions from the audience. As you're listening to these presentations, you might want to start inserting your questions into the Q&A platform of our virtual event here, because I'll be reading them out and posing them to the different participants. So I hope that's clear. We will end precisely at 1:15. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a lot of good material and questions in before that time. So thank you once again for attending. And now I'll turn to Ben Buchanan.
Thank you very much, Audrey. This is a great panel to be on. It's a great subject. Of course, as with all things in 2021, my only regret is that we cannot do this in person. Hopefully those days come soon enough. So to kick us off here, I want to do a couple of things. First, I recognize that it's quite possible, maybe even likely, that some people are a little bit less obsessed with what happens in the world of cyber operations than the 4 of us. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of what actually happened here, not too much. And then I want to offer a couple interpretations of what we could draw from this event, what this means for our study of cyber operations. Hopefully that will provide a good foundation for Alexi and Josh to build on. I think we know each other's work here, so hopefully we could have a good conversation. First, what actually happened? Now, there's two ways to think about what actually happened. The first is to do a very technical analysis of what vulnerabilities were exploited by these hackers who quite clearly seem to be Russian in their origin, how they gained access to the systems and what they took. The reason I'm not going to do that is the parts that we do know tend to be fairly complicated and unnecessary in the detail, and the parts that we don't know are also pretty extensive. So I think it's fair to say that just as a generalization, what we saw here is something called a supply chain hack. So the Russians were able to gain access to critical software or critical bottlenecks that enabled them to breach many different organizations at once. In fact, it seems quite likely they likely had more access than they had time to utilize. This gave them access to so many different targets, organizations in the US government, organizations in the private sector, organizations that were nonprofits, that they probably had to pick and choose of which organizations they actually wanted to follow up on. So one of the key intuitions here from this operation, transitioning a little bit into what it tells us about cyber operations, is that this shows us that the game has changed a little bit, that there's a model I think a lot of us have for how cyber operations work, where it's the lone hacker, in the hoodie, maybe in his or her mom's basement, trying to break into a single computer. And that's really not what happened here. And that's really not what happens most of the time in this business of nation-state cyber operations. What happens instead are largely scalable operations where the reconnaissance phase is extensive, the targets are carefully picked, and once compromised, compromising those targets enables access to many, many more organizations. So it's a different model of cyber operations. And I think that's the first thing that we can draw from this. The second thing that we can draw from this relates to a subject near and dear to my heart and to the book that Audrey very kindly held up there, with this notion of the security dilemma. Put it differently, thank you very much. We are here to flog books. The security dilemma, as I'm sure everyone in American university, at least in SIS, knows, is this notion that as one nation takes steps to secure itself, it can unintentionally threaten other nations. And put it differently, the interpretation of an action is often different than the intention of an action. And it's always been very interesting to me in cyberspace because I believe that cyber operations in general are extremely hard to interpret. And in fact, there's a blurriness between espionage and attack in cyber operations that is very present for the nation on the receiving end of an intrusion and totally clear, totally resolved for the nation carrying out an intrusion. The nation carrying out an intrusion knows if their goal is to spy or to strike. The nation on the receiving end has no idea. And this was, as Audrey indicated, the subject of my PhD and first book, because I think it animates some particularly damaging structural dynamics in international affairs, where nations have to kind of assume the worst, at least under security dilemma logic, about the intrusions. And what's remarkable, though it's not the first time, is that this is a case in which, for the most part, nations assume the worst. And if you look at the rhetoric at a minimum, and maybe also the reality around the US response to this intrusion, you had people in government talking about this, this is an act of war, it's the closest you can get to an act of war. You had people quite rightly pointing out, technically speaking, that the access the Russian hackers had for espionage could very easily have been converted to access for attacks. That this was a structural weakness exploited in American computer networks that would have enabled an incredibly widespread, at least in theory, attack against American computer networks. And you had people rightly being concerned about that. That doesn't change the fact at all that there's no indication the Russians actually sought to launch an attack, that this appears to have just been espionage. But it's this blurriness between espionage and attack that it makes interpretation quite difficult. And I think that tells us something fundamental, even beyond this case, about how cyber operations work and how the technical details play out in the arena of international affairs. Then I think there's a broader point about what are cyber operations good for? And at the risk of continuing a trope in which everyone says the SolarWinds operation confirmed all of their priors about cyber operations and international affairs, I think this suggests another key point, which is that cyber operations are really not that good for many of the things we often discuss in places like the Georgetown School of Foreign Service or the American School of International Service or King's College London. And by that, I mean, they're not that good for things like deterrence or signaling, and even in some cases, coercion. My argument is that they're quite good for what I call shaping, for gaining an advantage over another in this gray space between peace and war. I suspect this will fit with a lot of what Alexi and Josh will say as well. I don't want to claim it as only my intellectual turf, but I think this case confirms a lot of those intuitions and those hypotheses, that this is an opportunity for an actor, Russia, to carry out a widespread structural espionage campaign that it seems quite clear gave the Russians a notable advantage through the information obtained. And again, there's some ambiguity about what exactly was taken, but I'm confident in that statement. And there's no real way to deter this. It's not really plausible that we'll launch airstrikes in response. But in this gray zone between peace and war, this is an opportunity for one nation, Russia, to gain advantage over another, us. And I think that's quite striking. And that's a reminder, I think, of how the game of cyber operations is played. That this is an environment in which a lot of the things we talk about, deterrence, norms, coercion, really don't play out in the real world. But a lot of things we don't talk about, covert action, espionage, really do play out. I think we need to adjust our theorizing and our policymaking to account for that reality. And then the last point, I think, is that this tells us something about Russia, and it tells us something about ourselves. About Russia, it tells us, as if we didn't know it already, that we have a sophisticated and capable adversary here. And I think it's easy to look at some of the Russian operations in the past, particularly the Russian operations carried out by the military intelligence unit known as the GRU, and say, yeah, these are aggressive, these are brash, sometimes they even work, but they're not particularly good. That the tradecraft, the execution here is kind of mediocre at best, or maybe a little bit better than mediocre. That we can, not too long after the fact, put together a pretty good after-action report of what happened, why they did it, and how they did it. And that's not what happened here. I think it's fair to say the tradecraft, the execution of this operation is markedly better than a lot of what we've seen in the past from Russian hackers. And that might be because it's a different group carrying it out. You've seen a lot of theories about this being the Russian SVR, a different intelligence agency. I can't confirm or deny any of that, but it's certainly plausible, I think. But it's a reminder that just because we don't see something or we don't see it too frequently doesn't mean it's not there. And the louder, more easily traced and understood GRU operations are in fact only one part of a broader hacking capability from a fairly sophisticated and capable adversary. And as for what it tells us about us, the last point, I think this should be a sobering reminder that we spent a lot of time, a lot of money over the last 4 decades trying to secure computer systems. And even at a fairly fundamental level, the supply chain of the software that we use is still not secure. And when we recognize we've got capable adversaries, it should prompt us to reconsider how secure we actually are when big organizations like Microsoft and the like are successfully targeted by foreign actors, and their clients are targeted by foreign actors in an operation like this. I think we have to reevaluate where we are in actually securing computer systems. And this is a reminder, I think, that for as much progress as we've made in some discrete areas, securing individual computer systems and individual networks, we have a very long way to go in securing the broader software supply chain. To put it differently, this terrain of ones and zeros of networks and software and the supply chain that powers all of it will continue to be an arena on which nations will compete. And I think it's incumbent on us to recognize that and to recognize that the character of that competition is different than we might have assumed before. And this case offers good evidence of that. With that, I will stop there and turn it back to the rest of you.
Thank you, Ben. My goodness, that's a very sobering opening. There's a lot to ask about there, but I'd like to hear what you think, Alexi. Can you please go ahead?
Certainly can. I'd actually like to go back almost all the way to the beginning of Ben's statement, where he, I think quite rightly, decided that now is perhaps not the time to get into the technical weeds of what's just happened. But there are some aspects of it, I think, that would be useful for us to grasp before we consider this in more detail. And part of this comes down to the mention of tradecraft that Ben came to, and the level that we've seen with this attack and what that suggests about not all adversaries, but this particular one. And the very first place to start is where and who discovered this particular attack. And in this case, it was a company called FireEye. Several other companies such as this, cybersecurity companies, were targeted by this very same attack, but FireEye was the first to find it. But what's critical to note is that they did not find it when the attack began. They found it quite significantly after that fact. And the amount of effort they had to do to find the source of what was an intrusion into their systems was significant. What they effectively had to do was not go to the source of the problem instantly, but instead to simply rule out every possible system, every possible source of intrusion, which meant going through code of every piece of system that they were using that they had bought from outside. That suggests already a significant level of tradecraft that is beyond what we would see of any non-state actor, certainly beyond what Ben has classed as the old school concept of a hacker in a basement eating pizza boxes and stacking them up around them. It's certainly not the case here. And I think that level of technical detail is pertinent and one that we should be aware of, because it does color the other lessons that we should be taking away from this. And one of those comes back to the concept of fighting old battles. I've heard people say that, in the disinformation space, for example, that in 2020, we were prepared to fight the old battles of 2016, of external disinformation campaigns waged to undermine an election. But in so doing, we missed what actually happened, which was a domestic source of disinformation and information operations. So we were trying to fight an old battle that had passed and changed. I'm of the opinion that supply chain attacks of this are an old battle that we've not even realized we're fighting yet and have not given enough resources towards. There have been long discussions, even purely within the US, in the US framework of dealing with cyber issues, about the risks of diversifying supply chains, particularly the relationship between private sector supply chains within the US and the relationships with defense contractors and defense itself. But obviously, those conversations actually started back in the 90s, before the internet was as great as it was now. And then at least supply chains diversified, was still generally diversified within one single state. Now, the supply chains for the technologies which we rely on to communicate, to store critical important data, and to develop the technologies which feed into our military complexes or our security complexes are not diversified just within a single state. They are diversified internationally and regionally between some areas where higher standards of technical security exist and lower standards of technical security exist. And that is completely notwithstanding the political relationships between these regions and ourselves. And I say that as a European, despite Brexit, European. These relationships are important because they're all going to color what I think is a critical component here, which is trust. Because moving forwards, and this is why I'm going to try and go off track from Ben and offer something different, is that we need to consider, how do we engage with this particular kind of risk when we've seen now that it is a target of one of the most advanced forms of attack, with the most advanced forms of tradecraft we've seen for quite some time? What do we do now that the significance of the risk has been demonstrated to such an undeniable extent? Now, the extreme, obviously, is that we try and do a single supply chain that we have greater oversight of and greater control of. But anyone, I would think, in this group of people on screen with me now, let alone the rest of you in the room watching, would be aware that such an extreme solution, its solution though it might be, is nigh on impossible in the modern world. In order to grasp what I mean by that, you simply need to look at the implications for Chinese technology companies after restrictions on their ability to involve themselves in US supply chains of not just technical kind of trade activities, but also simply the trade of goods and resources. So semiconductor supply chains, microprocessor supply chains, they're global. China is, I guarantee you, attempting to make their own set, which they have greater control over. And that makes perfect sense given Chinese general geopolitical strategy and emerging technologies. We've not really done that. And I would argue we shouldn't do that. In my opinion, in some cases, diversity of supply chains is actually a good thing, particularly when it's something which is shared across states that have shared principles, shared ideals, shared direction, and shared security concerns. However, we still need to do something. And the biggest barrier we have here, in my mind, is that although increasingly pertinent in our discussions in the cyber realm, the relationship between private industry and governments and international institutions, we've recognized it perhaps academically and at a very technical policy level, but we haven't yet, I think, operationalized that as effectively as we could have done. We see private companies like Microsoft taking a greater hand in setting normative standards and also acting independently to try and critically close cyber risk, as we saw, for example, prior to the recent US elections, where they were closing down large botnets that were seen as a risk to the election and its continued operation in a successful manner. Some companies are starting to do the right thing. I don't think there's enough cooperation across the boundaries of company to private to public sector that we should be finding. That balance needs to be met. There's also the matter of reporting. So currently, as I understand it, there are 18,000 potential victims of the SolarWinds hack that essentially had this compromised update pushed to their systems. 50 of those have been identified as critical targets. So government departments, companies such as Microsoft and other security companies. There will be more. But from my brief preparation for this, looking at US federal and state law, as I understand it, there's very little forced reporting of actual hacks that companies or private industry have suffered. Now, as a European, where even in the UK, that's very different. We have very significant and strict standards of reporting, not just for privacy breaches as a result of a cyber attack, but also for infrastructure risk and risk to particularly critical national infrastructure, such as telecoms or power. And I think that is another facet of this that we need to address, is that if you're not aware of the extent of the problem, it's almost impossible to in fact deal with it. And that is the first step in building, coming back, as I said, to trust. We need to build trust between all of the actors that are involved in attempting to set standards and prepare themselves to face this risk that we now have been demonstrated to in stark importance. And the final thing I want to raise is that, again, building on what Ben has just said, is that we've invested a huge amount of money in cyber, both in NATO as an institution, but in various nation states in the UK, Europe, Germany, etc., and the US far above anyone else. I think that perhaps this is the time, arguably I think we could have done this earlier, but now certainly is the time to discuss the balance between offense and defense once again. There have been great discussions about whether there is such a thing as a viable defense in cyberspace. The nature of the field is in a way to be insecure. I've long heard the concept of there's no such thing as a perfectly secure system, and that to an extent is true. But I think perhaps we need to consider our investments and our approaches to defense, and that goes into policy and the concepts of deterrence as well, which I'm sure will come from the questioning. But I think that perhaps needs further assessment, and in the context in which we find ourselves now is the time to have that discussion. And I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Josh.
Yes, thank you, Alexi. Josh, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Audrey. Thanks to Alexi and Ben. It's really hard to follow that, right? I mean, Alexi and Ben are doing some of the best work on these issues, not just SolarWinds, but on cybersecurity more broadly. And, you know, I think they represent a generation of scholars who are able to look at these issues both at a sophisticated theoretical level, but also get into the nuts and bolts of them and deal with the technology. That's incredibly impressive and incredibly hard to follow, as I mentioned, but I'll do my best. Also, my Zoom dropped out right at the beginning of Ben's comments. So if I'm repeating anything he said,
you didn't miss anything. Don't worry. Don't worry.
I will say it again, but worse.
Yes, you did.
So yeah. In any case, I have two big points to make about SolarWinds. The first one is that when news of SolarWinds came out, there was a lot of hyperbole, frankly, from people in Congress, from commentators that were declaring that this was akin to war, right? And the level of rhetoric, even from the US Senate, was kind of amazing. And the first comment is that this is not a war. This looks like espionage to me. and it looks like part of an ongoing intelligence contest pitting the United States and Russia. Okay? This contest has been going on for decades with increasing levels of intensity. So far, we haven't seen the sort of nightmare scenarios play out. That is the use of cyberspace to sabotage infrastructure, to really break things in ways that would have lasting effects. We have seen a lot of evidence of spying, though. So I think we're on pretty safe grounds right now, thinking about SolarWinds through the lens of espionage, though that might change, right? The problem with looking at SolarWinds through the lens of an intelligence contest is we don't have a lot of theory about this kind of political conflict, right? An intelligence contest is not the same as war. It's not the same as arms racing. It's not the same as other kinds of political conflict. It has its own peculiarities. And as scholars, we simply haven't theorized the dynamics of an intelligence contest the way we've theorized war or arms racing, right, or diplomacy. We have theories on those kinds of political interactions going back centuries, going back millennia. Thinking about intelligence conflicts as a form of political conflict is something new. So I think that's what we're looking at here, but you got to approach it with considerable humility until we have a firmer theoretical base. The second big point that I'll make is we should be humble about assessing the consequences of SolarWinds. Right? We are still in early days. We're still trying to piece together exactly what happened, what was the scope of the operation, whether or not malware still lingers, and if so, what it's going to do or what it could do. Right? So we're still piecing together in open sources what's going on. Right? There's the Biden administration has called for intelligence investigation as well. You can assume that that's going on too. So we're still in early days, and we'll learn more about this over time. I think there's deeper reasons to be careful and modest about how we assess this event. One is that measuring intelligence outcomes is inherently murky. Right? As I said, this is not an arms race, and it's not war. This is not something that's easily quantifiable. And what constitutes a success and a failure is always a bit ambiguous in the world of intelligence. Another reason for humility about assessing the results is that a lot depends on the intruder's original intent. Right? If we assume that this was Russia, we need to ask, what did Russia want from this operation? And there's a bunch of possibilities. Right? One possibility is that Russia sought a long-term, open-ended espionage campaign, that they wanted this to last for years. They didn't want to be discovered. They wanted this to be a deeply buried exfiltration operation against private sector, against government, against a lot of different possible targets, right? And it seems from open source reporting that they were willing to invest a lot of time and effort into this. Right? Both Alexi and Ben mentioned the sophistication of the tradecraft. The New York Times reported sources telling them that there were over 1,000 engineers involved from the Russian side. I don't know if that's true. That was just what the reporting suggested. Well, if that's true, if this was a big organizational push for a long-term espionage campaign, then they might not be feeling like they've won. They might be feeling that a couple of months of collection followed by discovery isn't anything to cheer about. We have other historical cases which are quite similar. Cases from World War II, cases from the Cold War, in which really novel collection campaigns were revealed and then disappeared. And all of that good stuff that was coming in has dried up. In the aftermath of those episodes, nobody's giving each other high fives, right? Everybody is having recriminations. Why did we lose this access? Why did we lose this agent network if it was human gathering? So I would just say that if the purpose for Russia was a long-term intelligence campaign, they might not be feeling like they won. Right? They might be feeling like they had a missed opportunity. Now, on the other, making things even worse, if you're thinking about long-term espionage, exposed operations lead the other side to do heightened counterintelligence. So all of the urgency that you see in the United States today about getting public-private collaboration better, shoring up the supply chain, all of the steps that we need to take to improve this, that's going to make it harder for outside collectors in the future who would like to surveil using this kind of tradecraft, right? So again, ask yourself this: is the short-term benefit of a couple of months of collection worth the long-term danger of not having information coming in, right? If that was the purpose of this campaign, then it might not be a win. Now, on the other hand, it might be where the intruders had eyes on specific targets. That despite the fact that SolarWinds Orion product is pushed out to thousands of clients, they were only interested in a handful of those clients, right? And they were interested in specific kinds of information. Now, if that's the case, they might have gotten what they were looking for. We simply don't know, right? And it's up to the Russians now to sift through the sort of mountain of information that they exfiltrated to look for it, whatever that was, right? So it might have been that was their goal. A third possibility to be discovered. Right? There are times that you use intelligence gathering with the intent that your efforts will be revealed. And the idea is that you increase friction in the target state, you increase institutional fears, you increase a sense of disillusionment with your own institutions, right? And you sort of put your finger in the wound of declining public faith in US government, right? If that's the case, if SolarWinds was part of an effort to target US society and US institutions more aggressively, well, then the task for Russians is figuring out whether or not that worked, whether or not they were able to inspire internal discord consistent with their long-term objectives. Now, I'll just say, this is sheer speculation. All of this is just sheer deductive reasoning based on what Russia might have been trying to accomplish. We don't really know the motives behind the operation. All we can do at this point is try to imagine the intruders' next moves based on various possible motives for acting in the first place. Right? So even though we're learning more about the technical side, the underlying motives of the operation are unclear. Even when we're able to go beyond this kind of speculation, I think that measurement is going to be awfully tough, right? Imagine at some point in the future, we determine with certainty that the SolarWinds campaign was purely about stealing data as much as possible before discovery. And that's possible, right? Suppose we come to that conclusion, say, a year from now or 18 months from now, then we'll have to ask again, was this a win for the intruders or not? At a glance, the answer seems to be obvious. Yes, of course it's a win for the intelligence collectors. Just look at the scope of this campaign. Look how many firms and government agencies it gained access to. But on closer inspection, maybe not so much, right? One reason to doubt that this was a huge win was that if reports are correct, then SolarWinds hack didn't gain access to classified information. It got into some government networks, apparently, but I've seen no reports that it was able to exfiltrate classified national security information, right? At the same time, the campaign probably secured a ton of information, right? Given the scale of the operation. So it's possible that what happened was that Russia collected an awful lot of noise and not much information of real value, right? It might be where they have given themselves a gigantic signal to noise problem. They've absorbed a huge amount of communications and chatter and not a lot of really useful information. And now they're stuck with trying to figure out what it all means. Right, just to think through this problem, I think about your own email inbox, right? And if you're like me, you're on like a neighborhood listserv where people are constantly asking for information and posting announcements about free stuff on the curb and complaining about who didn't clean up after their dog and so forth. Every day, at least in my inbox, I get dozens of these messages, sometimes hundreds. And I have this decision to make of whether I want to take the time of trying to go through them. Right? Usually the answer is no. Now imagine that your inbox was suddenly big enough to contain thousands of neighborhood listservs. Right? Would you be better off for that? Or would you be stuck with a huge amount of low-level and mostly irrelevant information, right? When you're looking for stuff that really matters? I don't know. So I'll just end with this. SolarWinds, again, has encouraged a great deal of hyperbole, but I think we do need to approach this issue with humility, both in terms of how we understand the purposes of the operation, the consequences, and the best way to respond.
Great, thank you, Josh. Let me just offer Alexi and Ben, if you want to respond directly to anything any of you said, and then I'll ask a couple of questions. Alexi first.
I'd kind of like to come back on the what did Russia potentially get from SolarWinds, because there's a, I think it's exact, Josh is exactly right. I've not seen any mention of the exfiltration of classified data, but there are two things that I think that we need to consider here in terms of the intention and whether the Russians have achieved that here. The first comes back to my earlier kind of lyrical twist on the concept of trust. Is in this case, do you need to actually gain access to the data and steal it in order to undermine the trust in the data itself or what that data might represent? So I think there's a component here that we might consider that actually maybe the intention was not to steal the data, or maybe it was, but there's a risk of undermining our trust in our own capability and what we do still have secure by dint of the scale of this attack. And I think that's one component to bear in mind. The other bit actually comes back to the private-public component here, is that we're obviously treating the worst case scenario as the exfiltration of data from State Department or other government-run departments. I would argue that potentially the worst case scenario is actually compromise of the trade secrets of companies like Microsoft and FireEye. FireEye have already admitted that their red team tools were stolen, and that's a very significant danger because most of those red team tools are what allows them to be the leader, almost unarguably, in the field of cybersecurity assessment and management, and that's a significant risk. But even beyond that, the risk that trade secrets, potential exploits or means of production, or even the coding landscape of Microsoft and their processes has been half-inched by a Russian actor. That, I would argue, is probably on a par with risk of some trade secrets that could have been stolen from US government departments. And the final point to raise out here is that, I suppose this is my role in the evening, is we've talked very much US-centric. SolarWinds did not just affect the US. 18,000 companies and institutions have been affected. 50 of them have been identified by the US as critically important, but there will be more outside of the US. There will be government agencies that use the Orion tool set around the world. There will be private companies that had that effect. I err on the side that I think that Josh is right, that for me, I believe that the timing was intentional. And what better time to throw a spanner in the works than when your head of CISA is on his way out the door and he knows it. You're in the middle of an election, which is already taking up vast amounts of resources of your cybersecurity infrastructure to deal with. The timing is nigh on perfect and fits within, my opinion, kind of Russian operations in the past. So I would, if having to make a prediction, which I normally try and avoid, I would lean towards this being intentional discovery, not unintentional.
Okay, Ben, anything to add briefly before we go to questions?
Two very brief points. I will take, at least for the sake of argument, but probably more than that, the other side of this. I don't think this is an intentional revelation, largely because I think the tradecraft here is good enough that if the goal was to reveal it at some point, you would not need to take such operational security measures. But who knows? And more generally, I think, to borrow from Faulkner here, we shouldn't speak of this operation as if it's entirely in the past. It's not even past. It's a remarkable case in which the access was so extensive, it's so difficult to know where the hackers drop second stage malicious code to develop persistent access, that there's a very big risk here of organizations saying, well, we don't see evidence that we were breached, therefore we weren't breached. And there's a very big risk of organizations saying, well, we ripped out SolarWinds, so therefore we're safe. And that could well be, closing the barn door after the horse has left. And I think there's a real risk here that by looking at this operation as something that is over and trying to interpret what it means, we discount and disregard the really important facts that a lot of this access probably still persists for the intruders, and who knows what they might do with it in the future should they choose. Now, they might not choose to, but if you look at the structural dynamics of how something like this works, once access is gained by an intruder, it's very hard to kick them out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm going to take the prerogative and ask one or two questions before I turn to some excellent questions that have come in through the Q&A. So briefly, if we're looking at the relationship between Microsoft, say, and the US government, it seems that Microsoft's reach is so international, and also, their interests are somewhat different. What specific kinds of policy suggestions would you make in terms of making the public and private relationship be more effective? What Alexi has suggested that the United States, for example, needs forced reporting as currently exists in Europe. But in a broader sense, in the United States, we so much depend upon the military framing when it comes to cyber, whereas Microsoft takes an entirely different approach. What specific steps could be taken either by the new Biden administration or in the more broad international context to make that relationship more effective?
So, I mean, my first thought on this is that there have been in the kind of in the legislative world, there have been significant efforts for quite some time. During the Obama administration, it was much more normative. There was a lot of push towards norms of restraint and stability being one of the most commonly supported internationally. We had one UN group of governmental experts kick off. We now have two of them, one which is much larger. We've then over time shifted towards a more diversified attempt, including actually adding to international legal frameworks. But I think that there was one effort that actually started in that earlier normative stage that involved private industry that we should really encourage states to pick up on. And I'm probably biased in saying I have a great belief in norms as a normative scholar, but Microsoft, and particularly the executive Brad Smith, was very much in part, I think, mistakenly using the term of a Geneva Convention for cyberspace. Now, anyone who studies the international law of armed conflict knows that this is a significant reach to kind of go for that direction. However, his direction, the general drift of what Microsoft is intending, I think is very viable. There's a significant work of developing norm packages, including by a group called the GCSE, I always get the acronym wrong, alongside Microsoft and other companies. And their package of norms towards stability is meant to target both industry and states. And that, I think, would be a fantastic starting point, because we don't see enough actual action to do those things. There's been lots of political noise, as it were, but little in the way of action. And I think that would be a great and important first step to, in a way, put our money where our mouth is. It's very easy on the international stage to say that we think that we should be doing these things for the good of a safe and secure and open internet. But it's also then very easy for the Chinese to, for example, go, well, what about Edward Snowden, which they love to do. And I think that we need to do something to demonstrate how much we find that important. And I think that would also simultaneously start building these closer working relationships between the public infrastructure and the private in a manner which will hopefully benefit all in the longer term.
Ben or Josh, anything to say on this point?
Yeah, just to follow on Alexi's comments, one interesting thing about SolarWinds is the timing of it, and in one respect, the timing for the United States isn't bad. What I mean is that the timing of the revelation came after the election, and my sense is that the election was a case of public-private collaboration in a healthy way. My sense is that the industry was happy with the level of communication it was getting from CISA, from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and there was actually like good cooperation on election security both before and during the election. So so the revelation came in a period of kind of happy or happier relations that had sometimes been the case in the past. And in the US, at least, the incoming national cyber director, who there have been reports about who it's going to be, but I don't think it's official yet, I do think has an opportunity to build on that success, to build on the sort of good feeling of collaboration during the election period and say, hey, look, if we're going to get on top of supply chain issues, we both have a common interest. We both have to work out how we share information and how we understand the extent of this problem. So I think that there is I wouldn't say there's anything like fortuitous about this case, but it is an opportunity based on the recent history of public-private collaboration.
Okay, Ben?
Very briefly, the one point I'd add, I think it's in line with what Josh was driving at, is I'm not sure this is a story of the private sector failing, which is not to say the private sector doesn't fail. I think there are very serious questions about private sector cybersecurity and relations with the US government. But as Alexi mentioned, this is a case in which you do have private companies like FireEye who uncovered the intrusion, who sounded the alarm. Maybe there were parallel US government efforts we don't know about because of secrecy reasons. It's important to put that caveat in. But I think this is a case in which the private sector, at least the major companies in it, seems to have acquitted themselves fairly well in finding this intrusion and in leading an incident response effort to try to decontaminate the networks and give others information to decontaminate their networks.
Very interesting. Actually, I'm a big fan of Brad Smith, and his book Tools and Weapons is among my favorite. The Geneva Convention suggestion is, he's a lawyer, so that's a good reason for why he takes that approach. But anyway, I could ask more questions, but I think I'll turn to our smart participants here and ask the questions that have come in. And I may throw something in later myself, but here's something from Jair van der Stelt, and it's, how does the sophistication of this exploit compare to the more advanced cyber attacks we've seen to date, especially those in which the US's own offensive capabilities were at least ostensibly involved, like Stuxnet? So he wants you to put it in a broader historical context. Panel? Alexi.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So the craft involved in this one was of a different type to what we've previously, I mean, Stuxnet was mentioned. The tradecraft involved in Stuxnet in terms of leveling, and if you like putting it in a scale, was mainly involved around the exploits used and packaged to gain access. Now, at the time, that was what made it stand out in technical terms, the level of zero-day exploits used, how they were packaged together and deployed to reach the intended target. And that was, at the time, a key indicator that this was not your run-of-the-mill hacker, that this was most likely state-sponsored. The kind of tradecraft involved in SolarWinds is very different. It's not necessarily about the means of access, though that was significant in itself. What's most notable and done incredibly well here, and I would argue actually better than in most other instances, is it's the attempt to make this a lingering attack, the tradecraft with regards to removing trace, the obfuscation techniques involved. And not all of them were technical. This is important to note out, is that there are lots of means of nowadays automating defensive processes which are designed to detect the common means of gaining access and then hiding your access once it's there. One of the things that was done really interesting that I've read in this is that one of the methods of obfuscation that was used was essentially making the backdoors that were created after the effect, the initial one, appear to be accidental, poor network engineering on the sides of those who had been accessed. So in a way, they knew the kinds of automated defenses that were in place that would be likely looking for the more advanced methods of hiding an intrusion. And instead, they hid the intrusion by simply making it appear to be human error. And that is a very clever piece of work. But the technical bit was there as well. The self-deleting code, the general means of encryption, all of this makes SolarWinds a very advanced piece of tradecraft. And it comes back to my fellow presenters' earlier points that there have been a lot of, I think now, obviously now misplaced accusations that the GRU in particular has been something of a blunt instrument when it comes to its methodologies. Either this indicates that was a completely inaccurate assessment, or that there's a different agency involved here. But either way, this is far and away above previous instances of tradecraft coming out of Russia. So it's impressive.
Ben or Josh, anything on this question? Historical context?
It's just worth noting very briefly that Stuxnet, I think, has a whole nother level to it because it targets an industrial control system to have a physical effect. So that's a much deeper and more complex task. It's a different level of the game than this. So this is impressive, but no, it's not Stuxnet.
Okay. All right. Thank you. This question from Ian Reynolds: is successful supply chain security more about rapid and effective detection, mitigation, and response rather than security standards, especially in terms of high capability adversaries? So in other words, do we need to accept that some network intrusions will just occur and then work harder to mitigate and just respond to them?
I'll start here. Yes, absolutely. We should presume compromise, whether from supply chain or other vectors. The sort of perimeter-based defense mechanisms are probably necessary in cybersecurity, but they are nowhere near sufficient. Any major organization operating in the space needs to assume compromise and needs to find it as quickly as possible.
Yeah,
okay, Alexi?
I'll add to that. There used to be this idiom that in cybersecurity that there are two kinds of company: that those that have been hacked and those that haven't been hacked yet. The modern version of this is those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. And I think that, in terms of point defense, is important to realize is that there's no such thing as complete security by patrolling the boundaries. What we need is other methods of meaning that once those intrusions are detected, we actually have an effective response, and other means of policy deterrence in a way. But yeah, I completely agree with Ben.
I'm going to throw in a question here that follows up on this issue and some of what Josh was saying earlier too. If the right framing is to think of this as an espionage, as an intelligence operation, there's a lot of theory about intelligence. I mean, it's not so popular in most of traditional academe, not nearly as popular as, say, nuclear theory, defense, coercion, all of that. But there's quite a lot that's taught within the intelligence community. So how do we change the capabilities of those who are looking at this, not just within governments and traditional intelligence agencies, but also those who are looking at this from outside of those protected realms, and have them also use the kind of theory of intelligence and counterintelligence to apply to this case in creative ways?
So it's a great point. I mean, you're absolutely right that there is a lot of theory of intelligence, but what we don't have is good theories of intelligence contest as political exchanges, right? That we don't have that well-developed body of theory the way we have theories of war and arms racing and diplomacy as interactive processes over time. And part of the reason for that is that intelligence scholars for a long time have either been country specialists, right, or have been historians, which is great, but you don't have the sort of attention until pretty recently from sort of mainstream political scientists, IR scholars who are looking at this as a different kind of political exchange. How do you get this to different communities? It's a brilliant question, and I have a terrible answer, which is I don't know. The people who are involved in this will all have different needs, right? if I'm giving advice to US Cyber Command about what to do, it's going to be very different from the advice that I would give to a firm about what to do, because the needs are different, right? If you're an intelligence organization or a cybersecurity outfit or a firm, you think about supply chains very differently. I guess the only piece of overarching guidance I could give if I had them all in the room is to recognize the trade-offs which are involved. And this is where things get really, really messy. Alexi and Ben have already been on this, right? You can think about supply chain security in terms of trying to make it as ironclad and airtight as you can. But if you do that, you're going to pay a real economic price, right? It's akin to sort of closing borders and closing port entry to improve physical security, but that comes at a cost. So as people start to get together, and this is back to the public-private interaction problem, I think that we need to be forthright about some of the trade-offs that are involved here. Right? So even if you buy what I'm selling, that this is part of an intelligence contest, it's going to have implications outside the world of intelligence agencies.
Yes, I agree. But isn't it really what we're talking about is the difference between management and a concept of winning and losing? I mean, it really isn't about winning and losing. It's about relative advantage in this particular moment. Because I mean, I am a kid who grew up in the American Embassy in Moscow.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely.
By the GRU and the KGB, and you know, we did a lot of managing of what we knew were vulnerabilities. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So we're using the wrong set of theories, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I agree. And looking, and this is why I said we need to be humble. Like looking for clear wins and clear losses is going to end in frustration.
Okay. Alexi, you've unmuted. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the point that Ben kind of introduced really early on of hybrid warfare potentially being the middle ground here to talk about. I fully agree that this definitely not going into the hyperbole of this is not an incident of cyber war. In no case is that. What I think is important is that, in my mind, this kind of espionage in the cyber realm of many types, economic espionage or parts of statecraft, could often maybe be considered as not, as you say, trying to create a winner or a loser. There's no distinct end for start off. I mean, significant difference from theories of war. There's no beginning and end point. It's continuous, and that changes the game itself. But there's also, as you say, there's no winners or losers because the conflict doesn't end. There's no at which point are you assessing it, and on which grounds are you assessing it. However, in my thinking around this, particularly with regards to those which stray into the realms of hybrid war, my impression is most use of cyber espionage, or certainly a good proportion of it, can be framed as trying to set an advantage should there be a more traditional form of conflict. Mm-hmm. If you want examples of this in more specific terms, the Ukraine provides a perfect way of looking at it in terms of providing advantage prior to there being potentially an escalation to kinetic conflict. But also in more economic espionage terms, just look at what happened with the plans for the F-35. You can't tell me that that's not setting an advantage for whoever, I'm not going to make it completely clear, but whoever gained access to those, because again, this is a supply chain risk. So F-35 plans now no longer so as closely a controlled secret as their designers might hope. And that sets another shift in who has, or the playing field, as it were, should kinetic conflict take place. And I think that there are a lot of instances of cyber espionage that are essentially the actors doing just that. They don't want to reach the kinetic level in most cases, I don't think. But what they're doing is setting the point with these tools that exist at this threshold below kinetic to give themselves as much an advantage as possible should that take place. But important point to note, that comes back again to Ben's problem of signaling in cyberspace is incredibly difficult because it's all based on interpretation. How do we know that our attempt to stay under the radar or under the threshold of kinetic conflict will always stay there? I point out that the US used cyber operations as a response to Sony Pictures being hacked by the North Koreans because of a film that they didn't like. So there are perfect instances of what could be seen as a disproportionate response and the risk of interpretation there.
Okay. I'll move on to the next question. I apologize for the dog barking. Nothing I can do about it at the moment. Adam Yang asks the question, what is the relationship between increasing cyber espionage from China and Russia with national level espionage in general? Nations have been spying on each other for centuries, and in my opinion, unless these norms that allow spying in general remain, national cyber espionage will continue and even be tacitly accepted. So is all fair in love and spying? This is related to what we've been talking about. Any further comments? Ben, did you want to add anything?
Sure, I will take one side of this, and I think Alexi might have the other side. I'm not sure. Alexi mentioned a study on norms before. Yeah, my view essentially is this is part of modern international affairs, whether we like it or not. We should do everything to deter it, but shouldn't be too optimistic. We should do everything to defend against it. Where possible, where reasonable, we should impose costs for it. But speaking generally here, so it's not just about the SolarWinds operation, but generally speaking, I refer back to the comments from then Director of National Intelligence Clapper about the OPM breach, where he said something to the effect of, "We could have done this too, we would have." And it's worth noting the United States has extraordinary hacking capabilities, and I'm sure carries out its own espionage campaigns. Doesn't make me happy about the Russian intrusion. I think this is a huge, loss and a huge failure at some respect. But I think that the notion that norms will stop cyber espionage of this sort strikes me as unrealistic. But Alexi may have a more positive spin on what norms can do.
I would love to say that, I'd like to say yes. I think norms can have a positive impact. In this case, however, my pessimist kind of draws out. I think this is one of those uphill battles that is nigh and impossible to win. And the normative battle over espionage is not new. It's as old as statecraft, because it is statecraft. I think that battle might have already been won. And the reason why I'm quite so pessimistic is because, as any norm scholar knows, in order to change a norm, you need a very good norm entrepreneur with legitimacy. There is no powerful or well-placed norm entrepreneur that isn't as guilty of doing this sort of thing as those that they would accuse of doing it, which means that the potential for norms to be our route to counter this current upward trend of espionage and the acceptability apparently of it is highly unlikely. I'd like to say otherwise. I would say I'm a norm scholar that thinks they have a place and a theoretical means of explaining what's happening, but potentially they don't have as much power as I might like in some scenarios, and this is one of those.
So a tiny bit of optimism here. In general, I find it long-running intelligence contest can see the emergence of tacit norms, not codified, proclaimed rules of conduct, but tacit understandings among rival intelligence agencies. Right? And when you talk to sort of retired spies from the Cold War, sometimes they'll talk about the rules of the game that developed between sort of CIA and KGB, which is they were involved in a ferocious long-term contest, but they understood there were limits, right? There were families were usually off limits. Certain techniques of kidnap and torture of one's rival intelligence case officer is off limits. There were tacit understandings which kind of set the parameters for how they competed. Now, some scholars have speculated that over time this might happen with regards to cyberspace interaction, that as the US and Russia and China, as Adam mentioned, are involved in this, they'll kind of learn where those boundaries lie, whether or not intergovernment formal efforts at norms succeed or not. Maybe that happens in this case. I'm not sure, but it's certainly something to watch out for as we continue to watch this.
Okay, good. I'm going to combine two questions now from Johnson Pham and Sam Platt. Johnson is asking about whether there are diplomatic initiatives that the United States can be involved in. Alexi, you've touched upon that already with some of the talks that are going on internationally, but perhaps elaborating on that would be helpful. But also, Sam Platt wants to know if we overreacted, if the U.S. government overreacted, particularly the Congress, by calling this an act of war. How can we prevent that kind of rhetoric in the future? And how do states balance calling out bad behavior in cyberspace while also maintaining room to maneuver for their own behavior in terms of cyber? So those two questions, does anybody want to address either one or both? Alexi?
I'll have an early stab at both of them. So in terms of the current diplomatic ongoing processes, so it depends on how we frame this. In terms of cyber espionage, I think Josh and Ben and all of us, in fact, have been quite accurate this evening in saying that there's no international efforts of diplomacy talking about espionage, because if there's a norm that does hold true about espionage is that you don't talk about espionage. And I think that fundamentally is the issue. If we talk about what the hyperbole hints at in terms of cyber warfare, then yes, there are lots of ongoing diplomatic efforts towards the limitations and the standards and what is and is not acceptable in this space. The UN has one long ongoing group of governmental experts, small group, and there's now an open-ended working group, which is the entire chamber, which is obviously far larger and far more representative. And I'm a firm believer in international process and the role of institutions, and there would be space, I think, for the US to take up more efforts in both of these. They're members of both. To the second question, I mean, that's where things become more difficult. Like in terms of what we can actually achieve in policing activity, I'm doubtful that you're ever going to convince states to stop using this technology or developing it, for that matter, because it so far has been proved to give so much capability and things that they can in fact do. And that I don't think is going to change. The other point we need to bear in mind, although this talk has obviously featured heavily of some of the well-known actors in this space, the United States, China, and Russia, those are not the only actors. Cyber capability of an advanced type has been proliferating quite significantly in the last 5 years, and it would be unhelpful to miss over the fact that Iran has quite significant capability. Israel does as well. Saudi Arabia is developing quite rapidly, as is the United Arab Emirates and other Middle Eastern countries. And to count those out and to not understand that they are going to have an increasing role in this dynamic, potentially with even less intention of being restrained by whatever we attempt to do, either normatively, legislatively, or policy-wise, I think would be a significant mistake on our part.
Ben, any comments on this question about diplomacy and or that keeping the relationships more stable?
I think I'll pick up the second part of the question about how does a nation call out the activities of others while maintaining room for its own. I think, speaking generally here, nations are usually more comfortable than we might like with inconsistency, let's say. So I don't know that that's as much of a constraint as maybe some would like it to be. But also, I think there's a to go back to some of the logic of the security dilemma here, or if you want from psychology, the problem of other minds, there really is a well-worn history of nations saying, well, we know why we're doing this, and it's a fairly benign reason, and we don't know why you're doing that, and we're going to assume the worst. And I think that often, apart from sheer duplicity, that often provides this space to condemn others' activities while feeling like one's own are justified. And I think you can see that in many parts of cyber operations. You can also see that in Cold War thinking. If you look at, I think Reagan and Gorbachev both post-Cold War recognized unintentionally the fear they caused in the other. And I'm not suggesting, as a scholar who's written about the security dilemma, that the security dilemma solves everything or explains everything in international politics. But I do think in this dimension, it has some structural insights we can use to understand how nations perceive their own and, more importantly, each other's activities in cyberspace.
Okay. Josh, anything you want to add? No. Okay. So we have a couple of more questions. One of them we've already covered, which is about the relationship between public and private sectors in resolving issues in cybersecurity. And then there, I think we've already covered that one. And then there's a question about prescriptive measures. So I'm going to leave us on this issue of prescriptive measures. We have 4 minutes left, and I'd like to offer each of you 1 minute to tell me what is your most important concern going forward, and what prescription would you have, if any? What would be your top choice for changing policy or taking action in the future? So I'll begin with you, Josh.
Not being an expert on the question, I'm hesitant to be super specific. I do know that the GAO released a report in December, essentially chastising a number of U.S. government agencies for not taking this problem seriously, and it's just advising them to sort of get their arms wrapped around it, develop a plan, develop their own needs, start thinking about it systematically. If they start doing that at an agency level, I think that benefits will accumulate over time. But as I said, this is not my wheelhouse. I'm reluctant to be much more specific.
Useful prescription. Ben, please.
Just as attackers identify key choke points in cyber operations, the software supply chain and whatnot, I think defenders need to do so as well. And I think it's easy to guard against risks that are highly visible. It's much harder to guard against risks that are insidious. Put differently, we need to get better at building a threat model of what our adversaries are capable of and where they will target. It would not surprise me, though I don't claim expertise either, if that results in more centralization on the part of the US government. I don't think it's reasonable to expect every single agency to know the ins and outs of this stuff. And I think more centralization on cybersecurity posture, especially around things like supply chain risk and incident response, probably would have benefits. The Obama administration made a big push on this in their last year or two in office.
Okay, very interesting. Alexi.
I'd build straight back on from Ben's point about centralization and be somewhat self-serving in a way for my generation, is that there is a new group of policymakers within the houses of power in the United States, and those are the ones that have grown up and are with technology, are more technologically literate and are capable of speaking the language and understanding it. And I think that it would be a significant step forward to give those people a position where they can actually bring that understanding to forming more informed policies and actually shaping the direction. And I've already seen from the appointments that the Biden administration has begun making that I think that direction is being taken. So that's the positive note I'm going to leave it on. But I think we need to leverage the expertise that we have gained over the past several decades of the internet and do so as effectively as possible.
Well, what a wonderful thing to have a positive note to end on. I was desperately trying to figure out what that might be, Alexi, and you've helped us because it does seem to be a rather discouraging situation of still trying to find out a lot about what exactly the full implications are of the SolarWinds hack, much less trying to resolve and respond to them. So you've left us with something positive and optimistic, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Josh. Thank you, Alexi. This has been an extremely interesting conversation. I've learned a lot. I think our audience has also learned a lot. And I thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing in all things cyber. And I'll continue personally to follow your work. And I hope that everybody in the audience will do so as well. And I want to encourage you all to come to additional future Center for Security and Innovation and New Technology events. There's one coming up next week with Josh Rovner leading. And I know that it's going to be an extremely interesting event also on cyber, and in particular celebrating the 10th anniversary, I guess, Josh, of the, Josh, did you want to say a word about what it will be about? I think I'll let you do that.
Sure. U.S. Cyber Command just had its 10th birthday. And as part of that, they wrote an edited volume about a number of issues that they're grappling with. So we've invited some of the authors in that book to come and talk about everything from warfighting to defense to personnel issues. And it should be a really fun event. So that'll be February 1st at 5:30 p.m.
All right, so be there and save up some of the questions that have emerged from this panel to ask of the cybersecurity oriented panel that we'll be having next week. Thank you once again, Ben, Alexi, and Josh, and thank you, audience, for attending. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening, or in whatever time zone you're in. Have a wonderful one. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.